Hello, welcome to the first English colony. As we saw in the preceding days, the first Europeans to arrive in the New World were originally the Vikings, arriving around the year 1000. But the Vikings only stayed a few years in what is now Canada. They left and never came back. It would be almost 500 years before another European, Christopher Columbus, would visit the Americas. Columbus's voyage and the subsequent voyages of Columbus and other Spaniards linked the Americas and the other parts of the world, including Europe and Africa and Asia, for the first time in thousands of years. It changed people, and ideas in both areas, in both the Americas and in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Things were changed because of this contact that Columbus had first made and other Europeans kept up. So that's a pretty important concept. That first, the world was basically reunited as far as people were concerned for the first time, and information and ideas could travel basically freely from what they call the old world, Europe and Asia and Africa, to the new world, the Americas. Now, the first English settlement, Jamestown, was not the first European settlement in what is now the United States. The Spanish tried to create a settlement in what is today Georgia in 1526. They brought over Spaniards, they brought over convict Spaniards, they brought over some slaves from Africa, but the colony failed. The Spaniards sort of rose up in rebellion against their leader, and then the slaves burned down the housing that had been built, and basically many people fled to the interior, never to be seen again. The Spanish were successful in creating St. Augustine, which is now in Florida, in 1565. So that was the first successful European colony in the New World. It was 44 years before Jamestown. So Jamestown was actually not the first try the English made to have colonies in the New World. Rich Englishmen in the late 1500s got permission from the Queen of England to establish a colony in what is today North Carolina, Roanoke Island. And his idea was to establish this colony, use it as a naval base, and then the Navy ships that he had there would swoop down on the Spanish treasure ships, bringing that gold from the New World to the Old World, and he thought that would be a great idea to steal the Spanish gold. Unfortunately, those colonies, or that colony at Roanoke, did not work out despite 2 attempts to create a successful colony. Eventually, when a supply ship returned in 1590, there were no trace of the people at all. Apparently, those settlers had, for some reason, fled into the interior, never to be seen again. So it appeared that one person, even a rich person, was not able to set up a colony and keep it supplied and make it successful. And that's why a group of English investors, a group of rich Englishmen, started a company to start a colony in the New World to make money. The investors basically put their money into the company. They basically bought shares of the company, and then that company would send over men and material to build a colony in the New World, and hopefully that colony in the New World would show a profit, and then those rich investors would get a return on their investment, much the same way as most American companies operate today. It was one of the first capitalistic companies to operate at the time. So the Virginia Company of London got permission from the King James, to start the colony. And even though the company really didn't care how they made their money, basically the king suggested 3 reasons they should really start the colony in the first place. One was to find riches, specifically gold. After all, if the Spanish had found gold in their possessions, why couldn't the English find gold in their possessions or their colony? The second factor the king felt was needed was that he wanted to spread the religion, especially in this case, the Protestant religion, the Protestant Christian religion, which is a little different than the Catholic Christian religion that is spread in Spanish territory in the New World. And finally, they also wanted to find a water route to China. They hadn't given up on finding a water route to China. That's why Columbus had set sail, to find that water route to China. In the process, he discovered there was something in the way, two big continents. But people, even in the early 1600s, hadn't given up hope in finding a water route to Asia so they could get the rich spices and the good silks. So the three ships left England in 1606. They finally arrived at Chesapeake Bay, which is now in Virginia. In fact, the entire area was named in Virginia to name it after one of the English monarchs. And the settlers then sailed up James River, which they named after James I, who had given them permission to be there, and started a colony called Jamestown, naming it after their king. I'm sure they hoped their suck-up would help the king supply the colony or look favorably on the colony. At any rate, the colony, of course, was a little above where the lost colony of Roanoke had been located in what is now North Carolina. The people on board the ships were very optimistic, but that optimism did not last very long. When the settlers arrived, the first settlers built some rudimentary fortifications, and then things started to fall apart. One of the reasons was they landed in a malarial swamp. They landed in a place where there were a lot of mosquitoes, which carried malaria, which is a disease which attacks you, and many people die of malaria. They also chose a spot up a river, but not very far up a river. So they came into what they called James Bay, up James River, and started a colony. But the problem was the location was poor as far as the water supply was concerned. So the water was coming down from what we now know as the Appalachian Mountains into what we now know as Chesapeake Bay, and that was sort of fresh drinking water the colonists could have used, except for the fact that twice a day the tides came in, the tide from the bay. So twice a day the tide from the bay sort of pushed back the river water several miles up the river. Unfortunately, that's exactly where the colonists of Jamestown had landed. They sort of landed at the transition zone between the river and the bay waters. And when the colonists started dumping all their garbage in the river, thinking the river would take it into the bay and into the ocean, what happened was twice a day the garbage would come back up as the tides came back up, and basically then once the tide went down, the river would push the garbage back down, then tides would come back up, and so basically the garbage just sort of stayed around Jamestown, and that was not very healthy. Also, the council that had been elected by the company started to quarrel among itself about what to do and how to do it. They had didn't really bring useful farm supplies because their thought was they were going to find gold and then get on board their ship and bring the gold back to England. But unfortunately, they didn't find any gold. So they didn't bring many farmers with them to grow food, and they didn't bring any useful farm supplies with them. Most of the people at Jamestown, which were all men, by the way, at first, all went out looking for gold. That's what most of them did every day, went out looking for gold. They never found the gold. They never found the Northwest Passage. They never found a passage to India or China. They did find some Indians, but at first the Indians were sort of standoffish. These were new visitors after all, and they landed without permission. And sometimes disagreements with the Indians led to deaths of the colonists. So the colony did not get off to a good start at all. However, despite not getting off to a good start, for several years the colony sort of hung on at least. Thanks to resupply ships the company kept sending back, there were always people in the colony. However, in what's called the starving time, in basically the winter of 1609, only about 60 people were left when the next supply ship came in. So fortunately, again, the company was made up of a lot of rich people so they could keep sending supplies. If this had been one rich person, like had started Roanoke, the colony probably would have failed. But thanks to continued supply, the colony kept on keeping on. Until one day, a guy named John Rolfe arrived by ship. He did not arrive directly from England. He had set off from England to go to Jamestown, but along the way, his ship had gone through a storm. It had been wrecked on a Spanish island in the Caribbean. There, Rolfe had found a Spanish tobacco plant. Now, the Spanish were already making money off tobacco. In fact, they were making so much money off tobacco, they didn't want anybody else to make money off their tobacco. And so any tobacco plants that were in the New World, which is basically where tobacco began, had to be sent back to Spain. And the Spanish couldn't, then they had to refine the tobacco there and then sell it to others. So nobody in Europe had tobacco plants. They were grown in the New World and then shipped to Spain. In fact, the penalty for taking a tobacco plant back to another country besides Spain was actually death. But nevertheless, John Rolfe had arrived on this island. He found one of the Spanish tobacco plants. Eventually, a rescue ship was built, and he sailed to Jamestown. There at Jamestown, he discovered things weren't going too well, but he also discovered that Jamestown had tobacco plants. Unfortunately, they're very harsh-tasting tobacco. The settlers had thought about shipping to England, but one taste of the tobacco, one smoke of the tobacco said, ugh, can't use this. But John Rolfe took the Spanish tobacco and crossbred it, mixed it with the Virginia tobacco, and that produced a very mild-tasting tobacco that apparently was very pleasant to many people's taste. And pretty soon, that was the colony's big money maker. They were shipping tons of tobacco back to England. Just a few years later, Rolfe met Pocahontas, the chief's daughter, the local Powhatan's chief daughter. Now, I know in the Disney version, the Pocahontas is a very slender, beautiful woman, but the Powhatan Indians that lived in the area were not known for their tall, slender beauty. They were sort of short and squat, almost like a fire plug, almost like a fire hydrant would be built. Her father, Pocahontas' father, was the local ruler, king of the local Indians, the Powhatans, and had allowed the English to stay, and basically had started trading with the local English. But the local English were afraid that the king might attack them. The Indian king might attack them, and so the Indian king sent his daughter Pocahontas to live among the English, sort of as a safety, a safeguard, sort of as a show saying, hey, look, I won't attack your colony at Jamestown because my daughter's living there. And it's there that John Rolfe met her. Now, by the way, there's a story about John Smith meeting Pocahontas many years before, but that would not be a love story, because when John Smith had been in Virginia in 1608 and 1609, Pocahontas was like 12 years old. And even though John Smith had written in his diary that the king, daughter of the king had saved his life, there are several reasons to doubt whether John Smith was actually telling the truth. But by the time John Rolfe met Pocahontas, she was 19. She was an adult. She was living in Jamestown. She met and fell in love. He fell in love with her. She adopted Christianity as her religion. She changed her name to Rebecca. And just a year or so after the wedding, John Rolfe and Lady Rebecca got on board a ship and sailed to Tobacco to sort of publicize Jamestown tobacco. They were basically the salespeople. And when they arrived in England, they were welcomed by people around England. People came out to see this Indian princess. The King of England had them for dinner as far as guest was concerned. And things were going well. But just before the ship was to sail back to Jamestown, Pocahontas came down with a disease and died. She's buried in England. John Rolfe returned to Jamestown because Rolfe and Pocahontas had a son they had left behind. And so when Rolfe gets back, he remarries, he raises a son, and eventually the son marries and has kids. So there's actually many descendants of Pocahontas in the Virginia area today. But that's the real love story about John Rolfe and Pocahontas. And it wasn't a love story based on beauty, and it wasn't a love story really based on economics. It was a love story that both of them got along very well, and both of them sincerely loved each other and wanted to make a future with each other. So I think that's a much better version than the Disney version, because in the Disney version, people might think that you have to be a tall, beautiful, slender, almost like a model to have any happiness in life, and that's certainly not the case. So tobacco was a big saver of Jamestown, but there were some other things about Jamestown. 1619, by the way, was a big year in Jamestown, because up until 1619, land ownership was in common. That is, when the settlers arrived, you didn't own your own land. You can build your own house, but it was basically the king's land, the company's land. And you were expected to plant tobacco and grow that tobacco, and then everybody would put their tobacco sort of together, and then they'd sell the tobacco, and the money was divided equally. But many people didn't like this plan because it appeared that at least some of the people of Jamestown, perhaps many, instead of actually growing tobacco, they continued to go off to look for gold. So a few people stayed and grew the tobacco. Then, when they got the money for the tobacco, they actually had to share their money with the people that hadn't done anything. And so in 1619, the company decided to give people their own land so that they could grow their own tobacco. And whatever they grew, they could sell to the company, and the company would sell that in Europe. So the people that were out looking for gold, pretty soon they were dead, or maybe they sold their land they had and sailed back to England. But the people that planted tobacco and worked hard actually earned enough money to get more land from the company. So private ownership was important because people now, when they worked, they actually saw a reward for their work. They saw that they were getting their money for what they made, and they didn't have to share their money with people that didn't work. And that basically incentivized people, got people to plant a lot more tobacco. Another thing that happened in 1619 was the company decided to let the colony sort of run its own local affairs. Up until this time, from 1607 to 1619, if you wanted to make a law in Jamestown, you had to send for permission all the way back to England, over 3,000 miles away. Now, if you were lucky, the ship only took 1 month getting back. Usually it was 2. And then the company had to be meeting, but the company only met maybe twice a year, which meant that basically by the time the message got back, probably a year had passed since you asked permission for this law. And that might not be so bad for some laws, but what happens if you think the Indians are about to attack you and you want a law that says every person in the colony needs to practice their aim and their rifleship and their shooting ability to make sure they can repulse the Indian attacks? Now, if you send that message to England for permission to make the colonists do that, by the time it gets back, the Indians could have attacked you and you could be dead. So the company recognized that trying to sort of run things from 3,500 miles away and basically taking a year for messages to get back and forth was not very good for the colony. So the company decided to let the colonists basically elect some leaders in what's called the House of Burgesses. Burgesses just means a citizen. So the people that lived in the colony were basically citizens of England and citizens of the company. And that meant that basically what the company did was allowed people that sort of ran the large plantations by then to sort of elect representatives to go meet together at Jamestown to enact local laws. So by this time in 1619, people had sort of spread out from Jamestown. They had sort of started farms up and down the James River. And so the people up and down the James River now were able to elect representatives, send them to Jamestown. The people of Jamestown, those elected representatives, the House of Burgesses, they made their own local laws that applied to everybody in Virginia. Of course, technically, you had to send those laws to the company for their approval. So technically, the company, could veto the law and said no. But by that time, it might, be 2 or 3 years after the law was passed before the veto actually arrived. So this was one of the first attempts at self-government in the New World. People governing themselves, people electing leaders, passing their own local laws, and ruling themselves locally. Also in 1619, another big event, the arrival of a large number of women. Up until 1619, it was basically an all-male colony. There had been a few women, maybe 10 or so, that had arrived at Jamestown, but in 1619, the company sent over 90 women to marry the men. And they figured that if the men married, the men would have families, and the men would again work harder to provide for their families. And that would help Jamestown grow. So when the women arrived, by the way, the women were not made to come over, they volunteered to come over. But there were many poor women in England at the time, and so there was no shortage of volunteers. When the woman arrived as a male in Jamestown, as a planter in Jamestown, you didn't have to marry the woman. There was nothing that said you had to marry. But many of the men did marry, because of course there's several reasons men and women marry, and certainly companionship is one of those. So it worked out. All 90 women were married off to the men, and it worked out well for the women because, first of all, the life expectancy of Jamestown for men was not very long. So basically, after marrying maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 years, the guys that they had married would drop dead or have a disease and die, and the women would basically inherit the farm, the plantation, as it was called, because they were planting themselves in the New World, and they were planting tobacco to grow it. And now that property would be the woman's property. So the women could sort of get ahead in life by doing this, and it helped the colony as well, because again, the men basically married, and then they had more kids, and that provided, of course, more workers as the kids grew up, but also it made the men work harder. So less and less men went off looking for gold or looking for the passage to India. More and more of them stayed around Jamestown and helped build the colony. So it was basically good for everybody. Another thing that helped save Jamestown, and went through that pretty fast, were the Indians. At first, the Indians provided and traded food for the local people. Now, there was always a chance of some small-scale skirmishes between the Indians and the natives, but for the first few years at least, the natives traded with the people of Jamestown. It's only later in Jamestown history, when the colony seems to be gaining strength, when more and more Englishmen are arriving, the Indians realize that these people aren't going to die and go away. These people aren't going to move and go away. These people are going to grow and maybe take over Indian territory. At which point, the Indians mount an all-out attack to try to destroy Jamestown. They do succeed at wiping out about 1/3 of Jamestown, but Indian casualties are heavy, and eventually more English people arrive, and sadly for the Indians, they lose more and more territory. Another thing that helped save Jamestown was the labor force. You need workers. And workers were always in short supply at Jamestown because at first the death rate was pretty high. Your life expectancy was short for a number of reasons, including living in a malarial swamp, among other things. So at first, there were a large-scale number of indentured servants who arrived from England. These were people who wanted to come to the New World, hoping they could make a new life for themselves. Many of these were poor people in England that were begging on the streets for food. They realized that if they stayed in England, they were going to die pretty soon. They were going to starve to death pretty soon. And so they said, I'd like to get to the New World. So maybe if I get to the New World and maybe get some land and grow a crop, I might do pretty well in life. But of course, they couldn't pay for their passage over. Shipping was not free then or now. Just like airlines don't allow you to get on a plane for free, neither do passenger ships today. Hey, I'd like a free voyage. Sorry, pay up. In the very same way, back in the 1600s, you didn't get on the ship for free. Somebody had to pay. And as a person that was volunteering to go to the New World, you didn't have any money. So what happened was that the shipping company sent you to the New World, and when you got off the ship, one of the people that had a farm that was growing tobacco basically bought your passage. They bought your ticket. They paid the company back for all your food and for your passage. And in exchange, Now you were basically theirs. Now you weren't exactly their property technically. You basically agreed to work for them until you paid off what they'd already paid the company. So generally that was anywhere from 5 to 7 years that you'd be working for a farmer to pay off your passage. And once you paid off that passage, once you worked your 7 years and basically paid the farmer back, you didn't pay them off with money, you paid them off with labor. Once you paid off that passage and the 7 years or 5 years was up, you would be set free. You would no longer have to work for the farmer, and you would be set free to go work for yourself. Unfortunately, several things came in play. One, of the indentured servants that came over, 50% of them died before they ever got free. So again, life expectancy was short once you reached Jamestown. So indentured servants of 7 years, 50% of them didn't make it to 7 years before they died. Also, many of the indentured servants that came over were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. So who was keeping track of their 7 years? Well, the farmer was. And if the farmer was not a very noble man, if he wasn't a very moral man, the farmer might lie to the person and say, oh, I'm sorry, you've only had 6 years. You still owe me another year, even though you served 7 years. Also, anytime you were sick, that counted off against your days. You didn't get sick days. Every day that you missed not working, they added that onto your contract. You had to work full 7 years. Also, if you got married, they would add another year or two onto your contract, thinking that if you were married, you'd be spending a little time with your wife and now your children instead of actually working in the field. And so sometimes the 7 years contracts turned into 10-year contracts or 12-year contracts. Also, the British would eventually send over convicts, people in jails. So eventually, the British decided to rid their jail system of convicts by simply loading them on ships and sending them to Jamestown. Sometimes they gave you a choice in England. If you had committed a serious crime, they would give you a choice of either being killed or being sent to the New World, being sent to Jamestown to work. Of course, most convicts chose to go to Jamestown. Even though the survival rate was not that great, it was better than your survival rate in a prison, and it's better than your survival rate of getting your head cut off in the next week. Also, the British, the English, also gathered up poor children from the streets and sent those to Jamestown. At least over 10,000 children, 5, 6, 7 years of age and a little bit older, were loaded on board ships and shipped over. Once they got here, generally they were given a contract of 7 years, but it could be for 10 years. And early on, maybe there was no contract, and maybe the owners just sort of kept you until you died. So there were a lot of people coming over wanting a better life, but the death rate was very high, and the life expectancy was short, especially for men at the time who were doing the work. Of course, in 1619 also, a ship pulled up into the harbor of Jamestown. Now, the people of Jamestown had not asked for the ship to be sent over. When the ship pulled up, it was flying a Dutch flag. It was flying a flag from the Netherlands. It was actually, however, an English pirate ship, which had been attacking Spanish ships. And the English pirate ships had been looking for gold the Spanish were taking from the New World to the Old World. In this case, the English pirate ship had attacked a slave ship that were basically taking slaves from Africa to Mexico, to New Spain. And so when the British attacked those ships, they basically said, "Oh, there's no gold. Okay, we'll take the slaves and try to sell them for something later on." So when this ship arrived, there were 20 or so slaves on board, and the people of Jamestown didn't have any money or gold, but they did have some food. And so the ship captain traded the 20 or so slaves for food so the ship could continue its journey. Now, interesting enough, when the slaves got off, they actually weren't treated as slaves. They were given indentured contracts. They were given indentured servants contracts for 7 years. And we know that at least some of them actually lived past 7 years because there are records of some of those Africans who themselves became farmers, and they had indentured servants. It was only after about 40 years or so that the people around Jamestown started thinking, well, why are we like freeing these people coming over from Africa? You know, the Spanish are keeping them as slaves. The Portuguese are keeping them as slaves. Why don't we just keep them as slaves as well? So for the first 20, 30 or so years, the Africans were treated like probably any other indentured servants, at least as far as the records we have. In fact, we know that apparently at least a couple of those African indentured servants, somewhere along the line, had white indentured servants, because eventually the people of Jamestown, the House of Burgesses, passed a law basically saying African farmers basically couldn't have white servants. We also know, for example, of one case where at least one of the Africans went to court because one of his indentured servants, one of his African indentured servants, had run away from him and was basically serving a white farmer, and that didn't suit the original owner very good, who happened to be a fellow African. And so he went to court, and he basically got court papers that would enslave that person for the rest of his life. So things were a little fluid at Jamestown at first. Today there's a lot of talk about how slavery enters the New World at Jamestown as slaves, but first of all, it didn't enter into what we know in the United States in 1619, because the Spanish had settlements already, for example, St. Augustine, Florida, where they had slaves and also free blacks living among them. So that was 40 plus years before Jamestown even started. And we know for the first few years at least, the Africans were treated as indentured servants, and only later started serving as slaves. Of course, probably one of the reasons was that they were readily identifiable because of their skin color. And they didn't know the area. That was another good point as far as the local farmers were concerned. So the local farmers had tried to enslave, for example, Indians, but the Indians just ran off into the forest. And the local farmers, the local white farmers, couldn't follow them and find them because basically the local farmers got lost in the forest and they didn't know what the Indians knew. And so it was very hard to enslave the Indians, at least in the Virginia area. And of course, generally as the whites, the English people came over, they were indentured servants. So eventually you knew that if they had been there 10 years or so, that they should be free by now, shouldn't they? So it was very hard to basically keep other workers unless they were identifiable. And that's probably one reason the Africans suffered so much, was because their skin was darker than the others and they were easily identifiable as slaves forever. So sadly, that entered into American history in that regard, at least in Virginia, in 1619. Of course, I'm sure everyone wishes that would not have happened, and maybe that they would have treated everyone as indentured servants, and eventually everyone would have had a chance for success in Virginia. But unfortunately, we can't go back and change history. We can change the future. We can change the present. We can change the future by changing the present, but you can't go back and change the past, sadly, sometimes. So there are several things that helped keep Jamestown from failing. It wasn't really one factor, although tobacco was a big reason. There were other things involved in saving Jamestown as well. So Jamestown becomes the first successful English colony in the New World. Although it was a close thing, as you see by these population figures, at times there were very few people left in Jamestown. Sometimes maybe only 60 people left before new supply ships came and resupplied them. And you can see that of those people that came from 1607 to 1625, you can see over 75% of them were dead 25 years later. So Jamestown would probably not be your first choice if you went back to history. If you had a time machine, you'd probably not want to go back and visit Jamestown for a number of reasons. But eventually, Jamestown was the first successful English colony, and because people needed more acreage for tobacco, they started to spread out along the James River, started more settlements, And eventually Jamestown was the first town in Virginia, which eventually became an English colony by its own right, and eventually, of course, a state in the United States. So, thank you for listening, and that concludes Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, which, by the way, is an important year to remember. Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, the first successful English colony in the New World. It's often on test. So if you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, the first successful English colony.